Hello, everyone, and welcome to this workshop on this CIP that I've been working on for a little while. It now officially has a number, CIP-100. So this is the CIP-100 governance metadata. Technically, this is the second workshop. We did one back in April, but life got really busy, so I haven't spent a bunch of effort on this. I did another draft with some input from people at the Edinburgh workshop. And then this is the third draft, and workshop held online on. And so anybody who wants your name here, let me know, and I'm happy to add you to this, the acknowledgements for the third draft. Before we start, let's kind of go around to the people who are in attendance and just say your name, say, if you are just a community member, say I'm a community member. If you're working on a specific project, like an Explorer or a wallet or some tooling that's going to take advantage of this metadata, just talk a little bit about your project and how that's going to play into what you're building. So we'll start with Mike.
Mike, this Mike?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm product designer at IOG, so I'm working with Thomas, Lorenzo, and Ryan, who are also here. We're working on the Gov tool and a DREP Explorer to help you find your DREPs and others, all kinds of stuff related to that.
Yeah. Okay, so this is a very IOG heavy meeting, it sounds like.
Sadly, yes.
Okay, cool. Do you all mind if I put you on this document, or does anybody want their name to be left off?
I might think of an interesting alias.
Okay.
Doesn't matter to me. It's very, very kind of you to ask.
Hey, Nils. We were just getting started. So everybody here is from IOG. You're not with IOG, but can you just tell us a little bit about what you're building that might benefit from this CIP, or are you just here because you're interested?
You're talking to me, right?
Yes.
I'm the late person. Yeah. There's two reasons. There's two or three reasons. So first of all, I want to get like a general understanding of CIP-100 better than what I currently have. I actually met with the Intersect team earlier to talk about potentially applying for the grant with respect to the DREP platform, the DREP campaign platform, and so that would help me. And also, I need just generally a better understanding. I want to get deployed a node with SanchoNet here soon, because there are certain things for the Catalyst proposal that I'm working on that also includes potential connectivity and the ability for people to reach not only the projects based on NFT holdings, whatever, but and stake, but also potentially the ability to reach my DREP that I've delegated to, or the other way around. Actually, the DREP can say, "Hey, I want to send notifications, updates, whatever about something that I'm working on, be it a campaign or some draft or grant." And I want to reach everybody who has delegated their stake to me as a DREP. And that's the Catalyst proposal I'm working on right now, is focused on NFT projects and stake pool operators, but I think it's a perfect use case for that as well.
Very cool. So just some bookkeeping that both you and Santiago missed. This meeting's being recorded. It'll be up on the Sundae YouTube later. We're kind of just doing introductions on the projects that this governance metadata CIP might impact that you're working on. So the four at the top are all from IOG, building kind of governance explorer stuff. Nils is from working on a Catalyst proposal that kind of sounds similar, and about the communication between stake pools and their delegators, and DREPs and their delegators. Santiago, or somebody had their hand up. Is that still relevant, or?
That was me, but I have a question for Nils, but maybe we could have a talk after or something.
Cool. And then Santiago, do you want to talk just briefly about anything that you're building that might benefit from this? I think the reason I'm having people do this is I think it'll frame the discussion really well. So.
Yeah, so I'm interested in this CIP because I want to provide through Palas, which is a Rust-based library for interacting with Cardano in general, to provide some sort of interfaces and entry point to manage metadata such as this.
Okay, very cool. So, and did somebody have their hand up? Oh, going to go off cam. Okay, no worries. Yeah, so I just added everybody that's in this call. We've got a late attendee. I won't do a recap of everything because that's going to get tedious. Welcome, William. We just kicked off with introductions, and we're going to dive into this this CIP now. So, for those who aren't aware, this is a CIP that is kind of trying to establish a very extensible standard for how we can define governance metadata. It's not CIP 1694 specific in theory, but a lot of the terms that we use are overlap with CIP 1694. So there's that. And the basic kind of philosophy behind this, as I wrote it and as we drafted it in the previous responses, was the ledger can't enforce anything about the metadata. It can't enforce that it exists. It can't enforce the structure. It's basically, from the ledger's perspective, free-form data. And that's because we don't want to store all of that data on-chain, partly because of bloat, partly because of the kind of tricky legal ramifications of storing arbitrary data unmodified on-chain, things like that. Partly also because I think we want room for a lot of experimentation, right? A lot of, hey, maybe this CIP doesn't work out and a different standard arises in the future, and we don't want to kind of bake ourselves in the ledger into any specific format. That being said, for the kinds of tools that you all are building, a structured format where a computer can consume that metadata and provide rich tools would be really useful. And so this outlines kind of from the jump what that structure can look like. And it's designed in a way that it's very kind of unopinionated and is open to organic extension. One thing I didn't, so we can dig into it more, but the basic idea is that we use JSON LD, which is a structured JSON interconnectivity specification. Thanks, Santiago, for the suggestion. The very first draft of this, or the 0th draft, had a version where basically I was reinventing JSON LD, and Santiago pointed out that there's an existing technology for this, and so we decided to use that. And what this does is it lets us say, hey, here's the minimal definition for what constitutes a piece of governance, and then future CIPs can just define new terms. And the JSON LD document lets you specify, here are the terms that I'm talking about. So for example, there may be two different competing standards for the justification field, right? On a vote, you might want to attach a justification. And one of those standards, one proposal that somebody puts forth may be a just free text. It's just like it defines the proposal or the justification field as just a text field. And another standard may put forth a different definition of justification that is structured data. And what this proposal and what JSON LD allows is those two standards to coexist in the ecosystem. There's no kind of namespace collision because the document explicitly defines which definitions it's using. And then when you build tools, you can build tools kind of supporting the definitions that you've spent the time to invest. So for example, if you've spent the time to understand, quote unquote, the free text definition of justification, your tool, your explorer, can say, okay, as I'm reading this document, I found the free text justification, CIP-100 definition of justification, and I'm going to display that. And if I find anything else, I'm going to, display some raw JSON representation because I don't understand it and I don't kind of want to build tooling around something that I don't understand. But then, CIP-5183 comes along and it defines the structured justification field. And you update your Explorer or your wallet or whatever, and it understands this rich structured data. Maybe it's split up into a timeline of different justifications or, whatever the kind of example is. And now you can display a rich, you program in, oh, I understand this field, and so now I'm going to display that rich semantic information. So it avoids, for example, a pitfall with just like assigning a version, right? So like one way we could approach extensibility to this is we say, okay, here's a couple common fields, and it's version 0. And then a new CIP is going to define version 1, and here are the fields that are defined. And the reason that we wanted to avoid that approach, and we went with JSON-LD instead, is because that forces a consensus around what is included in that next version. And it forces a consensus around resolving name collisions among competing standards. And so this JSON-LD approach allows us to let people experiment with different approaches and let kind of an organic consensus of like, okay, well, most of the tools have standardized around this one particular CIP. And so it's got an organic kind of versioning rather than a strict CIP-based versioning. So that's, we have a late joiner. Welcome, Nick. I'm not going to recap what we've done so far, but I've kind of just been walking through at a high level the philosophy behind this governance metadata document. Before I kind of go any further, anybody have any questions on that philosophy, on that kind of high level description?
Yeah, I got a question.
No.
Could you give an example of how this would work? I mean, what it seems like to me is you're creating a framework for, what data we're looking at, for instance, like this is a general framework for data using JSON-LD, I guess, but like if in a case of like say DREPs, the metadata, the fields that they're associated with them, you'll have like, I don't know, possibly a name or friendly name or URLs linked to them, philosophy, political affiliation, stuff like that. That'll be a set of, say, X number of qualities. Are you saying that this will allow a developer, say of a DREP Explorer, to more or less arbitrarily define what fields that they want to use?
Yeah, so as a concrete example, so this CIP-100 outlines a very minimal set of fields. This is kind of what and they're common to all properties or all metadata like actions. So a vote or a registration or a governance action would all have
those
optionally these properties, right?
Okay.
And so in the JSON-LD document, which can I switch? Let me go ahead and switch to an entire screen view. And so if I bring in JSON-LD, we might have, this would say the context is, and then the URL to CIP-100. And, or specifically, like, there's going to be a JSON-LD document hosted on GitHub or posted anywhere really for this. And so the context field would make reference to say, hey, I'm using the definitions from CIP-100, right? And that means that if you see an authors field in this JSON, it's going to be an array of objects. Each object may have an address, a display name, and optionally a WC3 did, right? If you see the language field, it's, this specifies what language the other fields on this should be interpreted in. Now, suppose somebody wants to write CIP-101 and define budget, right? And so this is specific to governance actions. And so then a governance action can include in their context, they would, and these aren't just strings, they're going to be like URIs to the actual schema document, but this would include in it CIP-101, which would say, hey, if you see this like a field called budget, it's the budget that is defined in CIP-101. Then somebody else may have a different standard, say CIP-102, that structures budget in a different way. Ideally not, but maybe we're like the community is experimenting. Now you as a metadata explorer would say, okay, we have built CIP-100 support. And so when we see these, we know, okay, we're going to read out the authors field, the CIP-100 authors field, and that has an address in it. And so now I can provide a URL link to all governance actions and votes by that address, right? And if you see a different CIP standard, right, or say you also decide to implement CIP-101, right? And so you say, okay, now when I see a budget field, I can show a pie chart that shows the breakdown of the budget, or maybe like a payout schedule, or whatever the details in that budget field are. If you see a governance proposal or governance action with the CIP-102 budget, well, that's not the budget that you've implemented. And so you're just going to display like, hey, if you're an advanced user, just so you know, there's also this information, and maybe you display like a raw JSON, like a pretty formatted JSON dump of whatever that data is. But because you don't understand CIP-102, you can't know how to display that data in a safe or generic way. Now, suppose a month passes and you say, okay, well, I want to support CIP-101 and CIP-102. Well, now you can say, okay, if I see in the context CIP-101, I'm going to display the budget in this way. And if I see CIP-102, I'm going to display the budget in this way, right? So I think 90% of the time, we're just going to see like different CIPs by different authors for different purposes, and they're not going to clash. But the point is, this allows kind of that dynamic negotiation of what is supported without like your Explorer or your wallet just shitting the bed because it sees something it doesn't understand, or kind of maybe more subtly and more dangerously displaying misleading data because it thinks it understands a field, but that field is really for like a different implementation or standard. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's solving that problem quite nicely. What I'm wondering about, if I maybe don't understand this, but what about duplication of data? Like, whereas I create a second standard, a third standard, CIP-103, and I don't like your data structure. I don't know, maybe I'm a bit unpleasant of a person, and I got something else in budget. Fair enough, the schema will sort that out so it doesn't clash. But what I wondered, is it a concern that the kind of information will start to fray apart? Like, whereas you might want something in CIP-103 or 104 and 101. I know you can query it, but and how do you understand the whole space?
Sure. Yeah. So absolutely. The consensus there comes from two places. One is going to be what tools support, right? So if I come up and I create CIP-103 and it's just arbitrarily, I'm some random podunk nobody in the Cardano space, and I redefine budget, I mean, sure, whatever, right? But like, I have to go and convince the wallet to start producing metadata in this format. I have to go convince the explorers to implement that, right?
Yeah,
so there's
yeah.
a social consensus that forms around what people support. And then there's also like a momentum consensus where, you know, if I'm a new wallet and I'm looking to go and support, you know, as much of the governance as I can, I'm probably just going to go with the CIPs that exist, right? I'm not, and like the one that has the widest adoption, I'm going to kind of standardize behind that. So it allows the flexibility for people to be experimental, to kind of evolve a standard without breaking a bunch of existing tools. So like if there is community consensus behind, hey, we standardized around budget when it was really poorly understood, and now we have a much richer, detailed understanding of what is needed to be expressed, we as a community can define that standard and get that social consensus ball rolling without having to worry about like, oh, well, but if we redefine this field, then all of these tools where the developers may not have 6 months to go and re-implement, they're going to break in the meantime, right? They're not going to be able to fit it into their schedule to re-implement this standard until 6 months from now because they've got their own kind of roadmap priorities.
But people coming up with new features might want, say, if I want to add a new feature to my wallet and I can't wait for consensus, I'll just create another context or whatever, a schema, and say I want to add one other, two other bits of data, create CIP-105, and therefore that will differentiate my wallet from, because there's no standard. But then I suppose because it's there and it's created and it's public, the other wallets, if they think it's great, or the other products could just go in and use that data, and they can skip and hop through the hierarchy.
Yeah, absolutely.
To pick whatever they want. Okay.
And the key thing there is, by doing that, you're not breaking anybody else, right?
Yeah,
like, okay, your new features, your new way of representing the budget isn't going to be supported in the Explorer, but at least you don't like the Explorer doesn't like panic. It doesn't shit the bed. It doesn't, crash.
It's brilliant. I love it. I love it.
And then finally, one of the like kind of recommendations that we make somewhere, I think there's a section, but we make the recommendation that anybody building tools that is showing this data always has a like JSON fallback. So like if you encounter something you don't understand, at least display it as like raw text or give the user a link to view it in its raw form. And that way you get the best of both worlds where like as that wallet starts to produce data in this new format, people aren't going to get the like prettiest displays of the data, but it's still there for discoverability, for like, as people are digging in and doing research on things, they can see it in a decently human readable format. Niels, you have your hand up. Did you have a thing that you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, my question is for anybody that's familiar with XML. You mentioned that there will be like a reference, a URI that references, hey, this is the definitions. This is what the metadata looks like. Santiago may have an answer to that as well if he proposed JSON-LD. I like JSON-LD in general, but how are we dealing with? We have immutable data, right? So a governance action from 2023 or something like that goes on the blockchain will have a reference to, hey, here's the schema we use. You mentioned like it's a GitHub, thing. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, the person who is maintaining that GitHub, they're leaving the ecosystem for some reason. Maybe Cardano, isn't their game anymore, and we don't have a fallback, right? So obviously, new governance actions can refer to, oh, well, somebody has a copy, right? I have a fork of the repository, whatnot. I can upload it again. But how do we protect against loss of information? If the Explorer dynamically, if we're doing machine readable, how do we protect against, we had this one reference to this file and now it's gone. We don't really know how the metadata defines. For bigger standards, and you see this with XML, like I said, because the W3C, I think, is hosting a bunch of like XML definition files. And if their server is down, hundreds and thousands of systems are like, I don't understand this document. So
Yeah.
are we looking? Is there a way to support redundancies, or might it be good to actually say, you know what would be a good immutable resource to store a metadata definition for? It might be the blockchain, might be a good place. So is that considered as part of this SIP already?
No, but I think that's a really great call out. I'm less familiar with JSON LD than Santiago is. So maybe Santiago, do you know if they have a specific standard for handling that, or?
Not a specific standard, but the idea of a context URL or URI is that it should be mutable and static in a way. It's more like an ID than a way to fetch the document. Now, having said that, it is true that you have to fetch for somewhere it has to be the file that defines the schema. But I don't think there is a specific way of doing that in the JSON LD standard. I think it's interesting to think of how maybe we can also treat that as an issue that we can solve with the blockchain, maybe some sort of IPFS or a distributed storage system where we get content-based IDs, and those are what we reference as context whenever we want to specify a particular schema. But I would treat it as a separate concern, meaning that we need a way for static, immutable, long-term storage of schema definitions. That's one thing. The other thing is we want to share metadata, and we need to define some sort of schemas, what schemas and what syntax we're going to be using to express that data for the specific instances of the objects and resources that we are sharing.
Yeah, so
we'll get into this situation where we want to support people to build like machine readable automatic crawling tools, for example, that show you the correct way to display a governance action of any type. That can be fully automated if you can discover everything, from within the metadata of the object itself, which we already do this right with the token registry. It's a centralized service. You can clone your own, but generally currently it's a centralized service, and that's where you go if you have your token and you want to find out how many decimals, what is the person that created this token, what was their original intent.
Yeah. Two comments that I'll make is, one, I think it's the way more insidious or dangerous version of this is the content itself being available and robust. And we do have in this document a very strong suggestion that any content that you are producing, you should make an effort to host in a content addressable and immutable robust storage. So Arweave on the blockchain, etc. And the schema is like a much more toned down version of that problem because at the end of the day, even if we lose the schema, we as humans can look at the metadata and it's still interpretable. Like the JSON structure it's not a binary format that we have to reverse engineer.
Yep.
It is,
it's not
self-described or self-describing.
You could recreate it.
So I think that, it definitely is a thing that should be considered. And maybe we want to make a similar recommendation to say, hey, all SIPs that we standardize with these definitions should be hosted at a content addressable, robust storage medium. But in practice, usually the way that this is going to work is not, I'm going to go fetch this definition and crawl over and pluck out how to interpret the meaning from the schema with a machine. There may be people who do that, but I think the more common one is going to be basically you have a list of schemas that you support, right? So you say, hey, if it refers to this identifier, and it's basically just like an opaque identifier that I'm opting in to support and interpret that way, rather than needing to go and fetch that schema, right? It could be just the hash of the schema, and then I'm going to have a switch statement in my code that says, okay, if the context includes this hash, then display this. If the context includes this hash, then display this. So that's a really good note, that the JSON LD doesn't impose any restrictions on the URIs that you specify as this, but we might want to make a recommendation that says, something like the JSON, I don't know where I would put this. So this allows note any URIs in the context field should be content addressable and robustly hosted. Losing the schema is less dangerous than losing access to the content metadata itself. Should still prefer strong and immutable storage options for the preservation of context. And this actually brings up a good point too, because there was a discussion in one of the Telegram groups I'm in where people were really frustrated that these documents aren't getting stored on the blockchain. They're not getting stored in like transaction metadata, for example, because it means that every kind of content consumer has to implement something that's going to like fetch the content and index it and store it and things like that. And while we make recommendations that it be in some kind of robust storage, that's not guaranteed. And I do think it would be really interesting, not as part of this SIP, but as part of another one, to define a URI standard for referring to the metadata of a particular transaction. So the context could be, hey, if you want to find the schema, go and look, concatenate the metadata attached to these 4 transactions, for example. The reason I say concatenate is because we run into transaction size limits or whatever, and then the URI could be something like Cardano :
the transaction IDs,
transaction
list
hash,
of transaction IDs.
like define a URI scheme for, and I think that would be useful in a broader sense beyond just this proposal. But I also think it's a little bit out of scope for this proposal, but that's a really great.
I didn't want to derail it much more, but I think like your statement these are identifiers. They're not locations necessarily. They're identifiers, and if we treat them as such, then like we can have a scheme where that is a URL, or we'll just have it as an identifier depending on what your need is. Because I also think that with the current, like the proposal you have out here, we're probably not going to I don't know what schema definitions for JSON LD look like in terms of like how hard they balloon, but we don't seem to have so much metadata that we would be running out of what we could fit into a transaction with this. However, other SIPs may have much bigger kind of definitions. So yeah, I think that makes sense.
Cool. Thomas, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so the context is basically to say what the tool should expect to be in the metadata, right? So what fields the metadata should have.
Not necessarily what fields the metadata should have, but the definitions of the fields that you might encounter.
Okay.
And that's like a kind of subtle difference, but essentially, yes.
Okay. And then they would be, would you envisage that each context would have to be a SIP, or would that just be something that someone posts on their GitHub? Hey, this is my new metadata standard. Yeah,
I mean, in theory, it could just be, somebody publishes a metadata standard. I think in practice, if somebody does that, all of the tools are just going to see that as like a thing they don't understand, and they're going to fall back to the like displaying JSON. And if you want some hope of like adopting it widely, you would likely go through the SIP standard, but nothing about this enforces that.
Okay. And then so basically the definitions for the mandatory fields in this SIP, they are kind of almost reserved. They're reserved words effectively. right? So all of the tooling should recognize these fields as described here.
Yeah, and in particular, in theory, JSON LD has a mechanism for resolving namespace collisions. So imagine there was another CIP that defined authors.
Yeah.
Right. There is a way for the JSON document to say, hey, this is like to define both. And so they say, hey, this is CIP-100 authors. And I don't remember the exact syntax, and this is CIP, 201 authors.
Okay.
So you can, in theory, have both. The context now, by default, if you don't have, I don't remember the exact syntax, but by default, if you just see the raw text string, then there's you iterate over the contexts in order, and the first time you find it, or maybe it's the last time you find it, that's the one that you use. But there is a way to disambiguate so that if somebody wanted to publish a document that had like, oh, okay, there's some useful things about the authors here, but there's also some useful things here, and I want to publish both, in theory, that's supported by JSON LD.
Okay, so could it be the fact, if someone else publishes a CIP with separate definitions for these things, then that would make this CIP this part of the CIP perhaps redundant, right?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe this is something that shouldn't be in this CIP.
Yeah, I considered that. The reason to kind of provide a very baseline set is mostly as an example for other CIPs.
Yeah. Okay.
That they can extend on, and for some like pretty uncontroversial, like, okay, this is what we can expect on day one of like governance launching on Cardano.
Okay.
And if future CIPs in arguing over the semantics of how to define things, like either change these or extend these, those can come later without holding up like, government stuff. I think, when we have had these previous discussions, these 4 fields are kind of what we see as the like minimum viable product for this spec. And without these, it's like really hard to start building any kind of tools that publish things, or it's things that like, if we don't include them now, we're really going to regret it if people start publishing metadata without these. Like, so like language, for example, if we don't start recording the language up front, and we don't at least like strongly encourage people to record English versus Spanish, then we're like either being very strongly exclusionary to huge parts of the world, or we're going to have all this data that is unannotated, and we kind of just have to guess what the language is.
Yeah. Also, would you just explain about under authors? It's saying each address mentioned must sign the transaction, and then tooling authors should validate these signatures. How that would work in tooling?
Yeah. So the idea here is, I don't want to be included as an author on something that I didn't actually write, right? And so the interpretation of this field is specifying that in order to be a valid instance of this document, the transaction that is referencing it must sign that transaction with, this address or public key or DID. And if you're building an Explorer and there's an author in that list that hasn't signed it, make that very clear to the user so that they don't, it says, hey, this is included. We're going to show you that Pi is in this list because like they were included, and we're not going to lie about the metadata, but we're going to put a like warning flag on it because Pi didn't sign this, and he hasn't like necessarily, we're not saying that we're endorsing this. Now, that is one of the open questions here, is this is kind of just sketched out. So, whether this is a public key hash, whether there is some standard for, arbitrary keys so that we're not tying ourselves to the Cardano crypto. Maybe this is, you want to allow signatures from an RSA key, things like that. Totally open to input there if anybody has expertise. I kind of just jotted down like the idea here is we want some authenticity to including people in this list.
So from a tooling perspective, you either need one person to sign on behalf of like if there's a group, you either need one person to sign and say, I'm the main author, like I'm the author of this, and then perhaps there's some like other people who are, I don't know, part of the group or something, or you would need some sort of multi-sig support where everyone could sign the transaction.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah. Right.
I would
Okay.
say it might make sense, and that goes in align a little bit with what Ryan wrote, is instead of saying, hey, the object has an address, I think the object should have another, you can nest objects in JSON-LD, I would assume, something that indicates this is this is the verification. This is how it's verified.
This is your witness.
This is the witness. This is a pub key hash on Cardano, and you can verify it, and then there's potentially reference to something else. Oh, this is Polygon. This is something else entirely. Like there's a written document somewhere. So a reference to where is the proof that may or may not be actually, technically looked up. Now, ideally it is, but sometimes that may not be the case for if we're keeping this as a governance standard, for a crazy idea, somebody wants to use this, they want to use it locally and they have to, actually sign documents, then that could be a document reference to a physical document that they're signing, inside their whatever housing association or whatnot.
And that idea means that we can extend the types of witnesses just through new contexts that you add to the SIP.
That's pretty similar to what Adid does.
Yeah.
So Adid method just says, hey, this ID and this mechanism to go and fetch for the description of how to validate this ID, and that could be a private key or whatever algorithm.
Yeah.
So I think that what you just described, Niels, is pretty much what Adid does by default.
Yeah. The reason that, by the way, I said that it must sign the transaction is because there's kind of a tie the knot problem where, like, what do we have the witness sign? Because if it's just signing like their display name, then you could attach it to some other piece of metadata, right? So we need some standard where we say, okay, we're gonna start from the metadata document, scrub out all the witnesses, hash that, and sign that, or something like that. So that's something that I could use a lot of help with. If anybody wants to kind of volunteer to, maybe out of band from this meeting, is like somebody who's more familiar with DIDs or, the way this stuff is normally done. Each author must be authenticated with some witness.
Yeah, I would argue a simple way to do this definitely is the way signatures for other documents, XML documents in particular, way, like you said, you essentially take, this is the real content, and the content is not defined by that because you don't know ahead of time. And then here's, in your case, that might be the authors, and then that's what we sign, and we just ignore the author field. We don't, because we don't necessarily have to acknowledge that there's another author on it with me. Because I think it might be a little bit too complicated to say, I'm going to sign it with all the others authors scrubbed except myself, and then everybody has to do that. That would probably not be working very well.
Yeah,
but that's how they do it for XML documents as well. So that certainly would be something that makes sense.
Nils and Santiago, you both sound like you have a lot of experience in this area. Do you want to volunteer to spec this out a little bit more?
Sure. I'm not an expert, but I can chime in. Yes.
Okay, cool. So Nils / Santiago. Cool. So that resolves this open question. By the way, welcome to EP, and somebody else also just joined. I think they left immediately, but yeah, Ryan, you have your hand up?
Yeah, so this is aside from what we were just talking about. So I have a few questions, a few thoughts around the scope of this proposal, right? So are we trying to go for a minimum viable, and that can be extended easily, right? Is my understanding. If we're doing this, I think, it makes sense to have some nice common definitions as you've explained, and you get some really nice rationale for. I don't know if it's the place of this proposal to define all of these specific other types. So like you have listed here, like, you know, DREP registration, DREP retirement, you know, all of these other ones, and there's probably there's a couple more there, and a couple of these have been removed as well.
Yeah, and I think this comes from when I first wrote this up, I was expecting to find, like, as I talked with people or as we worked through it, to find like, oh, okay, this property makes sense for a registration, but doesn't make sense for the others. But then, like, once we wrote down and whittled down the list of fields, they applied to everything. And so, yeah, these are probably, you know, can be extended in the future, but probably just
that's great.
Set.
To me, that makes a lot more sense. Cool. And a second point I had, there is just below that section there, you mentioned about reserving the metadata label 1694 for like additional metadata or something like this. But for me, you know, adding transaction metadata into this standard, which is about the format of governance anchor metadata, doesn't really make sense, and I think it'll make things a bit harder, especially for like minimum viable stuff. So like tooling doesn't just have to, you know, be aware of metadata hosted at anchors, but also transaction metadata at the same time. I think it can make things probably a bit more confusing, a bit more complicated, and might not be needed for, you know, for this minimum viable approach. But don't get me wrong, I think a separate SIP would make sense for that, right? So you could amend metadata, or, you know, add extra metadata or something like this with transaction metadata. I think it's more sensible. But yeah, keen to have people's thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea here was to kind of solve twofold. One, there's a lot of people who are really upset with the fact that, like, with the idea of hosting this off-chain. And so this is basically saying, if you are going to host this kind of content on-chain, we're like, as part of this SIP, we just reserve this metadata label for that, right? And so your anchor may be to, like, the anchor, and maybe this goes back to the idea of a URI standard for Cardano. Your anchor may just point to your, like, to a transaction or whatever, right? But like, basically, I wanted to provide a way, and not necessarily like a way to indicate I'm not using the normal anchor system. I'm hosting it like alongside the transaction that I'm submitting. And that maybe makes sense to split into a different SIP, right? To say, hey, but I figured, like, this is like your bootstrap, right? Like, oh, all the other SIPs are like optional extensions, but this is kind of these are the things we have to support. And if we don't include this here, then, like, then we basically have told the people who intend to host their metadata on chain from the start to, like, fuck off, kind of, it feels like. And I could totally be convinced otherwise on that.
Yeah, it's just, for me, okay.
Yeah, like the problem I have is that this is we're like, if you're building I kind of agree with Ryan's initial point, in the sense that from a practical standpoint, in terms of tooling. So if like there are three separate types of metadata listed in this SIP. There's the metadata anchor metadata, there's the transaction metadata, and there's also external updates listed in the anchor metadata. And from a tooling perspective, we're gonna need to index the metadata so that we can read it into tools in a timely manner, so that people can use those tools. And the problem is that therefore the metadata, whatever's indexing that metadata, will have to read at least two of those three sources in order to provide that data to tooling. And so if we're building minimum viable tooling, right, that becomes that's bigger than what would be optimal for minimum viable.
Yeah.
And so it just, including this transaction metadata just gives us another thing that would need to be tracked, and it's more difficult for the tooling to track that, and more expensive and all of that kind of stuff.
So I'm going to respond, but I don't want my response to seem like I'm pushing back too hard. I'm like still totally willing to be convinced, but I kind of just want to go back and forth on this idea a little bit.
Yeah.
In the sense that one, I think, and if I don't mention explicitly, maybe I should, the idea is that all three of these types of metadata all are the same like structure. They all are JSON LD, so you don't have to worry about different parsing methods, at least, right?
Yeah.
And two, my worry with excluding either of these is like, these are both in my mind and in kind of the previous workshops that we had, the attendees' minds, they seem to be essential, right? On this one is if you leave this out of this SIP, then you know, maybe this is instead a pull request to CIP 1694, where CIP 1694 says there are two ways to link your transaction metadata, either the anchor or the metadata, like the transaction metadata. But like we're basically providing no door for anybody to like host things on chain, right? If you want to start hosting things on chain, then there's no standard for how to do that, right? Because it's not, there's in particular because this doesn't exist. And so we're forcing people down this rabbit hole or down this path of, well, I have to spin up IPFS, or I have to spin up an Arweave instance or whatever. And then second, from the external update standpoint, if we don't, like this one is a, you can't correct after the fact, in the sense of like, if I publish a vote or a proposal and all of that metadata is self-sealed, doesn't have a way to say, hey, here's where you go to find extended metadata, then we don't have a way to ever add extended metadata to that, right? And even if we establish a new SIP that defines an external updates field, all of those old SIPs or all of those old things that were posted on chain are like unsalvageable. There's no way to provide additional context from the author. And maybe that's tolerable, but the idea here was to say, okay, this is, you know, essentially just an array of URLs to say, hey, go look at this updatable field that's not content addressable. That's like, you know, if we find more information after the fact, like suppose we publish something on chain, a governance action, and then after the fact, new research comes out that contradicts or like changes or further strengthens the argument, or there's like a televised debate about it or whatever. There's no way to like, this would force a reverse index instead, where like, okay, I'm going to publish this new document that says, oh, this is a debate for that governance action, but it's not discoverable starting from the governance action, right? There's no way to say from the governance action, go find all the things that are updating it. And so it's going to be more expensive on tooling authors anyway, because now they have to say, okay, I'm going to index all these on-chain transactions and look for something that's referencing and maintain my own reverse lookup index. So that was my only thoughts there. I'm totally happy to move them out into a different SIP if you, if that rant didn't convince you, basically. Ryan, you have your hand up?
Yes. My problem with the I think the external updates, that makes a lot of sense. I think this is really sensible. My problem with the transaction metadata is we would need a URI scheme, right? Like otherwise, how else would tooling know to check the transaction metadata, or is it just
Well, if CIP 60, if the label in the metadata CIP 1694 is specified,
But should that overrule if there? What if there's an anchor as well? Like what would be the priority?
I guess
like,
what I
this
was
sort of thing we also
picturing-
need- sorry.
What I was picturing was the anchor would be like the empty string.
Sure. Okay. I think we want to explicitly define that, and for me, I don't know if it's the place of this SIP to explicitly define that. Well, I mean, maybe it can be.
I mean, yeah, I'm totally fine moving this into an adjacent SIP. I just think that given some of the personalities, like people are going to push for this to be like people are going to if I write that other SIP, people are going to be using it from day one, and so as a cooling author, you're going to want to implement that from day one anyway, right? And now there's like two different SIPs that you have to read in order to kind of
it's easier for everyone to adopt.
Okay.
Even if you know.
Make explicit that the anchor should be well,
just something like empty string or anything like this is reasonable. I think that's fine.
String when metadata on the so and I think this is only about the augments. So I will I need to redraft this section anyway, but
sure. Cool.
But and you know, to that point, a lot of this is May, right? A lot of this is the tooling authors still have a choice of like, okay, well, we're just, you know, we're not going to show what's on the transaction metadata other than maybe like, hey, there's stuff in the transaction metadata and like you can go peruse it if you want, but you know, right now we're not putting in the effort to support it. And so like, you know, if you're overwhelmed with the idea of like having to index and implement these different things, it's totally fair, I think, to say we're not going to index it at first. People may publish that and, you know, we'll just have incomplete data and then we can improve it over time, as opposed to the reverse of there's no way for people to, you know, do this and they come up with their own standard. And now you have things that are not necessarily like cohesive with each other. Anything else that here? So let's just go through, I guess, the open questions in the SIP. So one of the ideas here is that anytime we have hashes that we store either in the anchor or in the metadata, we tag them with the algorithm that's used so that we can update that algorithm later. Should we are people okay with that idea? It's a thing that I picked up from a project called PerKeep. It's like a big content addressable CDN server. They store their hashes like this so that if the hashing algorithm ever changes, you don't have this like awkward thing of like, oh, I'm trying to figure out what the hash is. So should we pick a specific hash? And then if not, what hashes do we want to support out of the gate?
Do people like Blake 2B? I want to say it might even be suggesting 1694 to use Blake 2B for this for anchor metadata, but I'd have to double check that. I know it was in 1694 at one point, but that may have changed.
Yeah, I think we're working on the assumption that it's going to be Blake 2B.
Okay. I thought that the CIP 1694 leaves the actual content like unvalidated. So it's like it's just freeform text with the intention that it is the hash. And so maybe that is again something that is better delegated to an update to CIP 1694 to say, hey, before we start producing a ton of data, let's just make sure that we include Blake 2B 256 at the start and then the hash.
It's not explicit 1694.
Yeah. So or I mean, maybe this is just being pedantic and we can just say, hey, Blake, you know, we can keep it Blake 2B 256 implicitly. And, you know, cross that bridge later if we get to it. I like the idea of like tagging it here, even if it's going to always be the same thing, because it doesn't hurt until you need it, basically.
Yeah, there's no downside to tagging it that I can think of. So tagging seems like a great idea.
But I think if we were going to impose that, it's probably better treated as a update to CIP 1694 as opposed to something that's codified in this particular CIP. That makes sense?
So where would this tag be, sorry?
So
Would it be included?
Basically what I'm saying is this line here, we should, instead of including it in this CIP, make it like an update to CIP 1694. So like,
yes.
right.
Understood.
Anchor, tag hash of the contents of the metadata URL. A tag hash is in the form Blake 2B256 hash. Future SIPs may. Like that. And then it's not a concern of CIP-100, it's really a concern of CIP 1684 to say, hey, we're going to specify what hash algorithm is used. And like, I'm totally even fine if it, like today we say the only one that's supported by people is Blake 2B256. Anybody have strong opinions? Okay, cool. And then like 2D256. This isn't making it part of the SIP, but it's just calling it out to say, oh, by the way, remember that in CIP 1694, this is made concrete. Thomas.
Yeah, I was just thinking that if we're going to allow people to use different types of so what you're proposing is that people could use different hashing algorithms? Is that what's being proposed here? But they should specify what hashing algorithm they're using?
In theory, I think as written right here, the only one that's officially supported is Blake 2B256.
Okay, yeah, because I was just thinking in terms of like verification, that would make it a bit harder for tooling providers to verify if there's multiple different hashes. They'd have to support everything, and then people could just use like random
like
hashing algorithms
meow hash or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, there's the idea here is let's make it explicit in the anchor, just so that it's kind of future proofing it. But officially, the only one that's supported is Blake 2B256. And then if we ever need to create a SIP to extend it with like, oh, okay, Blake 2B256 was broken, and so now we're switching to a post-quantum hash. We're not, then we have like a mixed bag of like an arbitrary bag of bytes, and we're having to, okay, first we try to hash it with this post-quantum hash, and then if that hash doesn't match, we try to hash it with, things like that. Ryan, what's up?
Yeah. Maybe this is, maybe I put it the wrong way around, but could we not do the hashing algorithm in the metadata itself? So you'd have to read the metadata, right? Read what hashing algorithm, and then do the validity check, right? Which would be a change in process. But it would save any changes to the design.
Yeah, then we don't have to update CIP 1694. So
but then what if someone changes what the hashing algorithm is supposed to be in the metadata? Then
then you just say this is
I guess
I support, right?
I guess it would make it invalid, right? And then
and then so the recommendation in CIP-100 is if you ever encounter something that the hash doesn't match, which you will, then you display a big warning to the user like, hey, this may have been updated since the time it was published, but you still display it, either as a raw JSON document or as what you want, right? So like if somebody lies about the hashing algorithm or uses one that's not supported, then you have a way to gracefully degrade in that situation. And we just say, at least for now, the only one that's officially supported, the only one that people need to be concerned about is a Blake 2B. And then like we don't have like hundreds of implementations and random garbage data.
Yeah. And maybe this is outside of this SIP, maybe not. But I was thinking about tooling, and so in terms of if you were going to index metadata, right, you would look for some sort of event on chain, like a DREP registration, right, or a DREP update certificate, right? But then if you're indexing at the time that they the time they do that, you're basically saving the metadata when it's fresh, right? And so you will probably have to go back and then check the metadata again at some point. So how often do you check that metadata, or do you not?
I mean, I think that's up to you, right? Because like,
okay.
It's like the most robust solution would have some kind of, once the hashes match, you save that forever. And if you are unable to fetch it at the time that you see the DREP registration, right? Because you have an eventually consistent system where maybe somebody publishes the transaction with the URL and the hash in it on chain, that gets minted into a block, and then like 30 seconds later, it's actually published on Arweave. Or they publish them at the same time, but the block gets minted faster than Arweave propagates through the network. And so your indexer makes the request, says, hey, this document doesn't exist. And then I guess what you would probably do is the next time somebody tries to load that page, we say, okay, if we don't have the document or the hashes don't match, let's make the request again to see if maybe it's like resolved itself since then.
Does somebody know how dbSync does it? Because dbSync has a similar algorithm with respect to stake pool metadata, but where it goes and it's like, hell, well, I'm going to check if that stuff's still applicable, right? Because any stake pool at any time could remove their metadata, or maybe they didn't pay for their hosting, and all of a sudden it's gone. And there's snapshots of the metadata, the latest at all times, but I don't know what the kind of heuristic is, as in, well, I didn't find the metadata. Am I going to mark that somehow? Or am I just going to keep the last one and say, hey, last check and last successful check, or something like that? And what are the timeframes there?
Yeah.
Because maybe there's a best practice to be had.
And I think maybe like ultimately it's outside the scope of this SIP. Maybe we provide like recommendations, but the assumption that this SIP is making is that you can find the metadata and that the hashes match. And if they don't, then if that breaks down for some reason, then like there's a problem and you display that problem to the user. So I really like, what was it, Ryan's suggestion of including it in the document. It does mean that like you have to like read and parse the document before you hash it to, so it's a little bit less awkward, but then we don't have to like touch CIP 1694, which is an absolute, hotbed of argumentation.
That's what
Ryan,
along those same lines. I mean, we want to add witnesses, right, or signatures of authors. We would probably also want to think about, what algorithm we're using for those signatures, right, and probably define that. And part of CIP-100, we could say, like, we could keep a registry of, hey, these are the valid hashing algorithms that all tools that comply with CIP-100 support. Same with ways of witnessing such signatures.
Yeah.
So we probably want it, in the signature field, or how we've labeled it here, like the algorithm that we've chosen to use.
Well, yeah, and so I'm thinking either we say, hey, we have a witnesses field, and each of the objects in that are like, it's extensible. They're expected to provide a context, right? So one of the things here is like, this document could look like authors. Let me make that an array. Let me make this bigger. So the first author, display name Pi, witness, and then this has a context field that says, oh, I'm going to interpret this according to this type of witness, and then it's going to be, but then, I think we also need to standardize, like the thing that this signs is always, we take this document, we delete the author's field,
Yeah.
we hash whatever we get, then you have to define a canonical serialization, so that when I delete that, did it reorder all the fields? So that's something that I think we should leave
Someone can
room.
volunteer to
Yeah, and
dig into. That's the trick.
I'll get around to it if you guys are busy, Nils and Santiago. I know we're all busy, so I'll get around to it at some point. But it would be really helpful to have somebody helping out. Kind of, we don't need to define the whole world. It just needs to be like the simplest thing that we can do now, and it's extensible.
Yeah, kind of like with the hash, I imagine. But have you decided on a canonical representation of the metadata document before hashing?
I don't. It's not in there. I think what I was thinking of is like, where do I? Because I do think I define. Basically, I was thinking that the hash is just the raw byte, just hash the raw bytes of whatever you get back. So that it's the host that determines the canonical representation. But I'm also totally fine to just define a canonical representation.
Yeah. Since if we go down the path of manipulating somehow the content by removing the witness, I think that we need other approach for canonical representation. JSON-LD has a way to turn everything into triplets of subject, predicate, and whatever value. So there is a canonical way to represent just the attributes that JSON-LD provides. I think that we should use that and filter out specific subjects, specific namespaces on the triplets of values.
Okay, so this is the RDF results, or?
Yeah.
What would you? How would you describe that?
I would say that we should describe the whole hashing mechanism, right? But in particular for the canonical representation, once you get the document from whatever external store you have, you turn that JSON-LD into triplets. That means validating the JSON-LD, and there are standard libraries for that. But once you have a set of triplets that represents the attributes that JSON-LD is providing throughout the document, we can decide to filter specific attributes related to witness signatures. And the end result, that the set that results from removing those items, is the one that needs to be hashed with some representation in RDF.
Can you dig up, I just want to link to something describing that?
Yeah.
It's not as clean as just using whatever we get back, which I kind of like the property of if I as a user want to validate this, I can curl and pipe it into, B2 sum. But I do, I think we've all experienced the nightmares
Yeah.
of Cardano not having a canonical representation, and it's been painful as hell.
Yeah, white spaces and line breaks. There are little nuances that make that approach noisy on the path, I think.
Yeah. Well, and it's easy if you always remember to kind of carry around the bytes that you got back, and like all your hashing is done on the bytes, but all your logical stuff is done on the like data structure you parsed out of that. But agreed, that's like from a programmer's perspective, that's painful. So like maybe what we do is we publish an open source tool where we can do curl document normalize B2 sum 56. Like if it's as simple as this, so like CIP-100 normalize. Like that could be enough to like, because what I want is somebody who's exploring this data by hand. I don't want it to be unbelievably burdensome for them to validate the hash themselves. And so I think a good kind of middle ground is have like if I can publish an open source tool that everybody can just install and validate it that way.
Let me double check that there isn't anything like that already for HLD, because that's one of the benefits. There is a
cool.
representation of the attributes.
And if we can get to the point where if we want this stuff also integrated into wallets and explorers, providing some sort of like open source libraries we can point to, is like, hey, this is part of this is part of Lucid or whatever. That should be.
So I'm actually receiving Intersect funding to build exactly that. So the first round I'm building a Go and maybe Rust. I can't remember if I committed to Rust implementation of this SIP. So there will be at least exist for those languages, and then if the Intersect, I'm happy to write other like TypeScript, blah blah blah, so that we have kind of these standard libraries.
Have Lucas do that. He loves TypeScript.
Okay, so while Santiago looks for something I can put in there,
I shared something on the chat.
Okay.
I need to dig a little bit deeper, but I think that's a good start.
Okay, I'll leave it as an open question then. Is RDF canon sufficient for our needs? Okay, so another open question is, so I just need to write this schema. I need to redo this. Write the augmentation paragraph. So here's an open question. The type of objects, this could in theory just be like a freeform text string, or maybe they yeah, Nils.
I'm looking into a standard as part of Riley actually pointed me to that as they work on Summon. Look into a standard for these updates, right? For the Catalyst proposal I'm working on, it's about, hey, I wanna send you a notification, or I want to send you information that I have published some information. And there's a standard. I'm trying to remember if it's ActivityPub or if it is. There's another one. I don't have it on this computer, but there are some standards that talk about publishing content and making statements about publishing this content. There's some W3C kind of standards that are being built or active that are actually also based on JSON-LD. ActivityPub, for example, is. So we might want to take a slice out of that instead of reinventing, our own version of it, because they have some examples as to what are some sources, what are some types of streams where announcements or proposals or any of these types of things are made.
Sure.
So I want to look at that. If you want to throw me on there to kind of put an idea in there, I'll take a look, find it again. I have it open on my other computer. And
what is the thing you
can
thought it
reference
was called?
It's called ActivityPub. It's a protocol definition, and there's an adjacent thing called, I think, activity streams, and I need to find out which of the two it is that defines some of this.
Yeah, and if it's based on JSON-LD, that's great. The way I've resolved it for now is we can just let each object define its type, like as the context, like lean into the JSON-LD and say, okay, here's the interpretation of this particular type, and then it can be video, blog post, Twitter thread, blah, blah, blah. And then if you don't specify a context, we'll just have a default one to say, hey, we assume that it is just a simple object with title and URL. Kind of a fallback so that, we don't have to, cool. If anybody's curious, here's a bunch of the other fields that we thought of in past workshops. Things like authorship history, a time and materials budget, like a sensitivity information, like, oh, this is an urgent hard fork because it fixes a critical security bug. Simulation data to show
is it just me, or I don't know what it looks on your screen, but if you select a line, like if you double click it,
really
there's nothing to it. That's impossible.
So we, ultimately these are out of scope for this SIP, but I left them here just because they're kind of interesting historical information that could be spun out into their own SIPs. Then we have some best practices. Here's, as a tooling author, feel free to, submit a suggestion for other best practices that you're adhering to that you think others should. But this is kind of just to get people started with, making sure that we communicate authentic data to the user. And I think that's it for the open questions. Anything? So there's, I think, a few more things to draft through. I'll go through, and we still don't have the actual JSON-LD document, but I'll go through and write that and then push up these changes in that document. And that should get us pretty close to being able to merge the CIP itself. Anything else anybody wants to talk about? We've been going for an hour and a half now, so. All right, then. Well, thank you to everybody. Does anybody happen to know, there's a couple people that joined late. Nick, do you mind me including your name on this?
Yeah, please do. I'm just kind of listening up, but yeah, thank you.
Okay, no worries. And is there anybody else? Let me look at the chat. I've got Ryan, Lorenzo, I've got Mike, I've got... Okay, and I think there was somebody who joined briefly. I'll include them just as a, thanks for showing up.
That was probably me. I got them on my phone, and then I hung up.
Okay,
I
cool.
had to get on the desktop site. So.
Oh, well, thanks for coming, and even just being here to hear and spread the knowledge about this SIP is helpful. So I'm happy to include you. If there's nothing else anybody wants to talk about, then I guess we can kind of adjourn, and I'll end the recording.